Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Mr. Chairman Bernanke, for being here today, and we thank you for your hard work. I represent a rural district in Virginia, one that has not seen the same economic growth that other places in this country have seen. We still have places in our district where we have jobless rates at double digits, and we certainly look to Washington to adopt policies that will make it easier for our businesses to succeed, our families to succeed, as opposed to making things more difficult. In listening to your remarks, you talk about adopting policies that go to systemic importance. Obviously, Basel III, it seems to me you discuss Basel III in terms of what is systemically important. You also tip your hat to Main Street, talking about the Fed has adopted policies to support Main Street, jobs, consumers, things that we all care about. In the aftermath of the rules that were adopted earlier this month relating to Basel III, Frank Keating with the American Bankers Association said that, asked the question, are we making things easier or are we making things more difficult? And essentially said if we're making them harder, that's not what we need for our economy. That's not what our recovering economy needs. So as I think about what we need in my rural Southside Virginia district, I think about community banks, and I think about what an important lifeblood they are to our Main Street economy. And I wonder if you could talk a little bit about the reasoning behind not just exempting community banks from the application of the rules that you all have adopted, and why you did that.
Well, I mean, I agree with you about the importance of community banks, particularly in rural areas which might not be served, by larger institutions. It's also important, of course, that community banks be well capitalized so that they can continue to lend during difficult periods, they don't fail. So we want to be sure that they're well capitalized. But in terms of the final Basel III rule that we just put out, we were very responsive to the concerns raised by community banks. They raised a number of specific issues relating, for example, to the risk weighting of mortgages, relating to the treatment of other comprehensive income, trust preferreds, a variety of things that they were concerned about, which we responded to. And that's part of our broader attempt through outreach, through meeting with advisory councils and so on, to understand the needs of community banks and to make sure that we do everything we can to protect them.
Go ahead.
I was just going to say that Basel III is primarily aimed at the largest internationally active firms, and most of the rule was just not relevant to small firms.
And clearly you all have tried to make some accommodations for community banks, and I recognize that. I guess my question is there a reason that you all, if you could talk a little bit about why you all concluded that you could not exempt them entirely? And I guess the second question is that I have is do you think, based on your studies or anybody else's studies, do you think that these rules will have a disproportionate effect on community banks? Obviously, that's the heart of the concern, is that the smaller banks have a much more difficult time complying with regulations than obviously the largest banks.
Well, again, I don't think that Basel III is primarily aimed at community banks, and the amount of bureaucracy and rules is not significantly different from what they're doing now. In terms of capital, the community banks are already typically held more capital than as a ratio than larger banks do, and our calculations are that community banks are already pretty much compliant with the Basel III rules. We don't expect them to have to raise substantial amounts of new capital.
So you don't believe there will be a disproportionate effect on the smaller banks in complying with these additional regulations?
Smaller banks are disproportionately affected by the entire collection of rules that they face, ranging from bank secrecy to variety of consumer rules, et cetera, et cetera. I think that your constituents may not be distinguishing Basel III specifically from all the other different rules that they face. And of course, a small bank has just fewer resources, fewer people to deal with the range of regulatory and statutory requirements that the banks have to deal with.
And just finally, when one of your earlier appearances here, we talked a little bit about the regulatory structure, what is perceived among some as a micromanagement by bank examiners and regulators in the function of the Federal Reserve as an examiner. Are you able to give us any indication of what's been done in the last 2 years or so to try to improve that? I know that you had mentioned that there were some things that the Federal Reserve had in mind and was trying to work with our smaller banks.
Yeah, I'm not going to have time to go through the whole list, but we have a Community Depository Institution Advisory Council, meets with the board, gives us their perspective. We have a special subcommittee.
My time has expired, but do you believe that these efforts have been successful?
I think we've made definite progress, yes.
Thank you.
The time of the gentleman has expired.